October 21st, 1943. 2:20 hours. The forest outside Smolensk burned in brief. Fitful flashes trace a fire cutting bright lines through the mist, the ground trembling with the pulse of artillery. A Soviet T-34, its hull scabbed with dried mud and soot, lunged forward until a metallic shriek cut through the thunder. The left track tore loose, whipping free like a broken belt. The tank slewed sideways and stopped, half-turned toward the German line. Inside the steel shell, 4 crewmen swore in the dark. At the controls sat Guards Sergeant Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya, 38 years old, 5 months into combat, and already notorious across her brigade for the simple reason that she was there at all. The tank's V2 diesel idled down, coughing smoke that mixed with the mist. The turret gun spat bursts into the tree line to cover the lull, but the real fight was happening a meter above the earth. Mariya kicked the clutch, slammed the engine kill, and felt the tank exhale. She looked at the indicator panel oil pressure flat, left drive idle. She didn't hesitate. "Hold them!" she shouted, voice steady as the recoil. The loader stared. "Comrade under fire!" But she was already kicking the driver's hatch open. Cold air bit her face, sparks peppered her coat, and she climbed out into the black-orange glow. In her right hand she carried the pry bar every T-34 driver called their second weapon. In her left, a sledge no heavier than her conviction. Bullets sowed the dirt around her boots as she crawled toward the thrown track, 2 tons of dead steel draped uselessly beside the hull. Mariya had been told since training that a thrown track under fire was death. Doctrine said, abandon, seek cover, wait for recovery crews. She preferred her own doctrine. If it runs, we live. She worked by instinct, palm to frozen steel, eyes slitted against dust, teeth clamped on a track pin. She levered the links one by one, feeling the tank's weight pressing against her courage. Inside the turret, her commander fired in disciplined bursts, counting the seconds she'd bought him. The loader knelt beside the breech, feeding belts, murmuring prayers neither of them believed in. When the sprocket finally caught, she banged twice on the hull, the signal. The engine roared back to life. She dove into the hatch as the T-34 lurched forward, caught the last rung with her boot, and slammed the cover down. The cabin filled with the smell of diesel and gunpowder. She grinned, blood on her lip, grease on her cheek, and jammed the throttle. The tank rolled again, spitting fire from its gun like a living thing newly reborn. Only months before, Mariya had been a telephone operator in Tomsk, a widow living on ration cards and rage. Her husband, an officer of the Red Army, had died near Kiev in 1941. The letter took 2 years to find her. When it came, she sold everything. She owned her furniture, her jewelry, even the bedding, and sent the proceeds, 50,000 rubles, to the State Defense Committee with a note. "I wish to donate a tank to the fight and drive it myself, in memory of my husband." It should have been ignored. The Red Army received hundreds of patriotic letters a week, most from civilians seeking symbolic vengeance. But this one carried an accountant's precision and a widow's authority. The order came down in February 1943. Approved the request of citizen Oktyabrskaya, assigned to her a T-3476 manufactured at Ural Vagonzavod. Permit training at Omsk Tank School. In Omsk, the men laughed first, then watched her work. She was older than most recruits by 20 years, small enough that her boots needed extra soles to reach the pedals, but no one studied harder. She learned to strip the V2 engine blindfolded, to balance the 4-speed transmission on her knees, to synchronize double clutching until the gearbox purred instead of screamed. In 5 months she passed every exam, gunnery, maintenance, field, a repair with marks equal to or better than her male peers. When she graduated, the commissar gave her the tank she'd bought. She christened it Boyevaya Podruga, fighting girlfriend. The phrase sounded like propaganda, but she meant it literally. This machine would be her companion in the only conversation that still mattered. The brigade quartermaster listed the specifications in cold ink. Model T-3476, 1942 production. Armor thickness, 45 mm sloped at 60 degrees. Main gun, 76. 2 mm 34. Engine, 4, 2, 3, 4 Diesel, 500 horsepower. Weight, 26,5 tons. Crew, 4. Those numbers could not measure what she brought to the controls: patience, defiance, an ear for the heartbeat of machinery. Male crews doubted her at first. Tank crews were tight families, welded by trust and superstition. They joked that a woman's tank would bring bad luck. The jokes stopped after her first engagement. That debut came outside Smolensk in September 1943, the offensive that cracked the German Dnieper line. Her unit, the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, entered the fight with 32 operational T-34 seconds and lost half within the week. The terrain was a grinder of bog and shell hole, the air thick with the wine of Stukas. Mariya drove like a woman, translating fury into horsepower. In her after-action report, the battalion commander wrote, "Driver Oktyabrskaya maintained mobility under fire. Engine restarted 4 times in combat. Behavior excellent." That line earned her the battlefield rank of sergeant and a reputation that hardened into myth. The crews began calling her the Mad Mechanic. Not an insult, an invocation. If a tank broke down, she was the one who could make it live again. By October, the advance slowed. Smolensk burned behind them. Vitebsk lay ahead. The nights froze. On the 21st, her tank led the left pincer through a stretch of churned farmland, when a German anti-tank gun scored a lucky hit. The shell didn't penetrate the armor. It struck the left drive and wheel, snapping the track clean off. The tank skidded, nose down in the mud. For 15 minutes they traded fire across 100 meters of nothing. The crew inside heard the enemy's 37mm shells ping off the hull, heard their own gun answering in methodical fury. Then silence, the gun jammed. Smoke filled the turret. That was when Mariya decided she'd fix both machine and fate with her own hands. What she did next would be reported in 5 separate unit diaries and confirmed by 2 eyewitnesses. She climbed out under direct fire, repaired the track in 5 minutes flat, re-entered, and resumed the assault. The T-34 advanced, destroyed the German gun, and held the position until relief arrived. Later, her commander recorded the result in plain language. Track replaced under enemy fire. Tank continued action. Enemy anti-tank battery neutralized. Casualties, nil. The file crossed desks up to the divisional political officer, who underlined the last word nil and wrote in the margin, "Propaganda material, courage of Soviet woman mechanic." But those who'd been in the hull that night knew better. It wasn't ideology, it was physics, skill, and a will so dense it bent the math of survival. When dawn broke, frost crystallized on the hull letters, Boyevaya Podruga. She touched them with a gloved hand, and the paint felt warm from the night's fighting. Around her, other tanks coughed back to life, engines growling in chorus. The men saluted as she climbed back into the driver's seat. In the brigade logbook for that day, the entry is terse: 21 Oct 43, combat near Smolensk. Fighting girlfriend engaged, track damaged and repaired in action. Enemy position destroyed. Crew morale high. No mention of the woman who had crawled through gunfire with a pry bar in her teeth. Yet among the crews, the story travelled faster than any dispatch. They repeated it by fires and in trenches, trimming nothing, adding nothing. A tank had broken and a mechanic had refused to let it die. The letters came back unopened. That was how Mariya Vasilyevna learned her husband was dead silence first, then bureaucracy. It was 1,942 inches, Tomsk, and the newspapers carried only maps and numbers, never names. The last envelope she sent to the front came home stamped, "Addressee deceased, unit destroyed." She stared at it all night, then took off her wedding ring and dropped it into a teacup. By morning, she had decided what to do. She sold everything: furniture, linens, even the embroidered tablecloth she'd made before the war. Her friends thought grief had unbalanced her when she handed the proceeds 50,000 rubles to the local war bond office with a request written in clean cursive: "I wish to donate this sum to the building of a tank. Please name it Fighting Girlfriend and allow me to operate it in memory of my husband, Sergei." Patriotic letters were common that winter. but this one climbed past the sensors like smoke through cracks. The Soviet press adored symbols, and here was a perfect one. A soldier's widow turning loss into steel. The Kremlin approved her request. Somewhere in Omsk, an overworked quartermaster drafted a memo authorizing her training. The officials who signed it assumed she'd fail long before reaching the front. Omsk Tank School sat between rail lines and forest, a landscape of smoke and shouting. The instructors had no patience for sentiment. They handed her overalls 2 sizes too big and told her that tanks didn't care who drove them. Mariya didn't argue. She learned instead. At dawn, engines barked across the yard. The V2 diesel, 12 cylinders of Soviet metallurgy, had to be coaxed into life like a temperamental god. Fuel pump primed, flywheel spun, starter cranked. The engine coughed, then thundered awake in a cloud of black exhaust. Mariya memorized the rhythm. She learned to hear imbalance in the injectors, to smell the difference between burning oil and leaking diesel, to feel through her fingertips when a gear wanted mercy instead of muscle. Her hands became calloused, her hair cropped short under the tanker's padded helmet. The instructors, at first skeptical, began using her as an example of discipline. "Oktyabrskaya doesn't talk," one said. "She fixes." Every Soviet tank driver mechanic lived by a single creed: keep it running. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, where repair depots were days behind the line, a crew survived by its own ingenuity. The T-34 had been built for such self-sufficiency. Its wide tracks floated on mud that swallowed German panzers. Its 76.2mm gun could kill anything it faced in 1942. Its armor, 45mm sloped at 60 degrees, could deflect even an 88 at range. But what made it a weapon of endurance was simplicity. A pry bar, a hammer, and spare track pins could resuscitate it under conditions that would doom a panther. By the end of her 5-month course, Mariya could strip and reassemble the T-34's gearbox in 30 minutes, adjust clutch cables by feel, and refit a track alone in under 10. Her final evaluation read, "Knows the machine completely, calm under stress, suitable for frontline service." When she joined the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, her presence drew stares. Crews were small families of men who trusted each other's reflexes with their lives. A woman in the driver's seat disrupted that symmetry. Her commander, Lieutenant Pyotr Chebotko, introduced her without flourish. "This is Sergeant Oktyabrskaya. She owns the tank." The crew of Fighting Girlfriend, gunner, loader, and commander were younger than her by a decade. At first, they treated her with polite detachment. They assumed she would freeze under fire or break down in the mud. But the first week in bivouac silenced most of that. While the men smoked, she crawled under the hull with a grease gun, checking every bearing. When the battery froze overnight, she lit it back to life with alcohol-soaked rags and sheer patience. The loader once joked, "She'll start tightening our teeth next." She didn't smile. "Only if they squeak," she said. Within a month, the crew stopped questioning and started believing. They learned that her ears could diagnose problems, theirs couldn't hear a dry bearing, a loose road wheel, a failing gasket. She taught them to clean the air filters with snow, to drain the radiator before frost so the water wouldn't split the block. "The tank," she told them, "is alive. If you treat it roughly, it will betray you." Her letters home to her sister from that period survive in the archives, each neat and factual, almost mechanical in tone. "We are preparing for offensive action near Smolensk. The tank performs well. I have adjusted the clutch." But between the lines ran a different current, pride and grief intertwined, one feeding the other. By late summer 1943, her unit crossed the Dnieper in pursuit of retreating German forces. She saw cities flattened to ash and corpses frozen in mud like road markers. Yet she also saw fields of Soviet tanks stretching to the horizon, the proof that industrial endurance had become a weapon more decisive than courage alone. Stalin's factories at Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk were producing over 1,000 T-34 seconds a month. Each one carried the labor of welders, machinists, and women like her, forging the Red Army's heartbeat from iron and fire. To the Germans, the T-34 was a ghost appearing where bridges shouldn't hold, charging through mud that immobilized half-tracks. In interrogation reports captured after the war, Wehrmacht soldiers described their dread not of Soviet gunners, but of tanks that never stopped coming. One officer wrote, "When we hit them, they repaired themselves." They didn't know that sometimes the repair was a woman under fire, fitting a track pin with frozen fingers. That autumn, Fighting Girlfriend led its first major engagement outside Smolensk. The mission: advance through a fortified hamlet, crush machine gun nests, hold until infantry arrived. The plan unraveled within minutes. German 37mm shells snapped off trees and tore into the earth around them. A hit disabled the track. The tank slid sideways into a ditch. Mariya's commander ordered evacuation. She refused. 5 minutes, she said. She climbed out, sparks skipping across the armor, and worked the repair while the others covered her. When she returned, grime blackened and grinning, the tank rolled forward again, belching fire. That action made the brigade reports, and her nickname spread, the Mad Mechanic. To the propagandists, she was a heroine. To her crew, she was a fact, the woman who could make death hesitate. In the frozen nights after battle, when engines cooled and the smell of cordite faded, they sometimes heard her whisper to the tank in the dark, half prayer, half command. "Come on, girl," she'd murmur, patting the instrument panel. "Tomorrow, we live again." By November 1943, the forests west of Smolensk had been stripped bare by artillery. Trees stood like blackened ribs. The air smelled of cordite and frost. To most tank crews, the front was a blur of mud, exhaustion, and orders shouted through static. But for the crew of Fighting Girlfriend, every sound had meaning: the faint knock of a misfiring cylinder, the metallic clink of a track settling back into its guide teeth, the distant hum that might be a German half-track or just the wind. Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya had learned to interpret those sounds the way a medic reads heartbeats. Inside the driver's compartment, her world was a rectangle of green steel and vibration. She sat half-reclined, legs stretched to reach the clutch and brake pedals, head tilted toward the tachometer. The air smelled of diesel, gun oil, and sweat. Her gloved hand rested on the gear lever, ready to force the T-34's 4-speed transmission through its stubborn gates. Above her, the gunner and loader worked in a rhythmic duet of motion and shouting. The tank was not comfortable, but it was alive, and she was its pulse. The 26th Guards Tank Brigade was pushing toward Vitebsk, trying to crack the German rear lines before winter closed the roads. Mariya's unit, the 3rd Battalion, had 16 T-34 seconds operational when the attack began. By dusk on November 16th, 7 were still moving. The rest were burning, bogged down, or waiting for parts that would never arrive. Fighting Girlfriend was the only one in her platoon still capable of full speed. The men joked that her tank was cursed, but secretly, they believed it was blessed. At 2,300 hours, they received orders to advance under darkness, cross a frozen creek near Novoye Selo, and knock out a German machine gun nest, delaying infantry movement. It was supposed to be a quick raid. It turned into legend. The night was so cold that the oil in the engine turned to syrup. Mariya spent half an hour heating the V2 diesel with a blowtorch and soaked rags before it would start. Once the tank rumbled to life, she let it idle, warming the gearbox and breathing steam into her gloves. "Don't kill the engine," she warned the commander. "If it dies out there, it won't start again." They moved out in blackout conditions, following the pale glow of the horizon and the crunch of snow under the tracks. The sound was strange, half whisper, half thunder. In the distance, the Germans opened up with flares, painting the field in ghostly white light. Bullets snapped overhead like cracking branches. Mariya's knuckles whitened on the controls. Halfway across the frozen creek, the tank shuddered. A mine, buried under ice, went off beneath the left track. The explosion lifted the hull half a meter and slammed it down again. The track was thrown free, spinning away into the dark. The T-34 slewed sideways and stopped. Inside the turret, panic pressed. Close. The commander shouted over the intercom, "Track's gone. We'll call recovery." Mariya's answer came cold and immediate. "No time." She unlatched the hatch and climbed out, the world erupting in tracer lines and snow. German machine guns raked the creek bed. their fire cutting red stitches through the frost. She slid down beside the thrown track, already reaching for her tools. The pry bar's handle was slick with frost, the steel so cold it burned. Her training at Omsk had drilled every motion into muscle memory. She crawled along the side, pried the damaged links apart, replaced a bent pin, and began to lever the track back onto the drive sprocket. Each motion was mechanical, automatic. Above her, the gunner kept up suppressing fire, the turret rotating with a groaning whine to protect her. 5 minutes later, the track was seated. Mariya slammed her fist twice on the hull, a signal the crew knew by heart. The engine coughed, caught, and bellowed smoke. She dove through the hatch, slamming it shut as tracers rattled off the armor. "Forward!" she shouted, shoving the gear lever into first. The T-34 lurched ahead, the new track biting into frozen earth. The German machine gun nest that had pinned them was still spitting light. She dropped the clutch, the commander called, "Fire!" and the 76mm gun answered with thunder. The shell hit the position dead on. By the time Soviet infantry arrived, Fighting Girlfriend was parked at the edge of the village, steam rising from her engine like breath from a living thing. The track she had repaired under fire was blackened but holding firm. The next morning, the brigade commander came to see for himself. He was a tall man with a face like carved wood. He walked around the tank, noting the damage, then looked at her through the driver's hatch. "You repaired this alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, Comrade Colonel." He paused, then smiled faintly. "They call you mad, I think. They're right. But it's the kind of madness we need." That evening, a courier brought a typed citation for bravery and a small metal flask filled with vodka. The crew toasted her in silence. Nobody joked anymore about propaganda. Her fame spread quietly through the front. Crews from other battalions stopped by their bivouac to see the woman mechanic who fixed her tank under fire. A photographer from Pravda came and took her picture standing beside Fighting Girlfriend, the turret name just visible beneath a crust of ice. When the story appeared in December, it read like myth. Comrade Oktyabrskaya repairs her tank under enemy fire and destroys fascist strongpoints. Soviet women fight with steel hearts. But her comrades remembered something less poetic. A woman lying in the snow, hammering a frozen track into place while bullets sparked around her, then climbing back inside to drive straight through hell. Weeks later, in the lull before the next offensive, Mariya overhauled the engine herself. She drained the oil, replaced a leaking gasket, and adjusted the clutch linkages until the gearbox shifted cleanly again. When asked why she worked instead of resting, she shrugged. "If you wait for the war to fix itself," she said, "you'll wait forever." Her commander recorded that quote in the unit log beside the repair record. By the end of November, Fighting Girlfriend had fought in 3 engagements, each time returning to camp scarred but functional. Mechanics from other units began using her tank as a field reference: how to replace a damaged idler arm, how to clean fuel filters using snow, how to realign the drive sprocket with a shovel and rope. In a war defined by destruction, her defiance became a small, shining act of creation, the art of keeping something alive when everything else wanted to die. The front shifted again in December. Orders came to prepare for a new offensive toward Vitebsk. The tankers polished their guns, checked the tracks, and packed rations. Mariya sat inside the hull, hands resting on the controls, eyes closed. Around her, the engine ticked softly as it cooled. Outside, snow fell in heavy, soundless flakes, settling on the turret's faded letters, Boyevaya Podruga, Fighting Girlfriend. The name was hers, but by now, it belonged to everyone who had ever believed that a machine, like a human heart, could keep beating as long as someone refused to let it stop. January 17th, 1944. The village of Shvedi, near Vitebsk. Dawn broke as a smear of pale light over black snow. The 26th Guards Tank Brigade lined up behind a low ridge, 37 T-34 seconds idling in formation, exhaust curling upward like smoke from a factory floor. Inside one of them, Fighting Girlfriend vibrated against the earth, her engine warm and impatient. Sergeant Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya sat at the controls, eyes on the frost-rimmed periscope slit, Orders had come through in the night. Advance on German fortified positions, seize the ridge, and hold until infantry arrived. Intelligence predicted light resistance. It was wrong. At 7:30, Soviet artillery opened with a barrage that rolled across the snow like thunder made solid. The tanks moved forward, first gear, second, then full throttle. The horizon erupted with the muzzle flashes of German 88 seconds, their shells whistling in from hidden emplacements. One struck the tank beside Mariya's instant fireball, turret lifted like a coin flipped by God. She didn't look away. "Straight ahead!" shouted Lieutenant Chebotko, her commander. "Left company pinned." Mariya gunned the engine, felt the T-34 leap forward. The 76mm fired, recoiling like a giant's hammer. They crushed through barbed wire, over trenches, the machine groaning under its own momentum. She was calm, almost serene. In her headset she could hear the chatter of the other crew's half commands, half screams. A second hit came from the right. The shell tore through the fender, showering the driver's compartment in shards of steel. Something struck her shoulder, but she didn't register pain. The clutch slipped. She forced it back with her boot. Then the world lurched an explosion under the hull. The left track snapped, flinging steel links into the snow. The tank slid sideways and stopped, one corner dug deep into a crater. Smoke filled the cabin. "Track's gone again," shouted the loader. "We can't move." Through the periscope, Mariya saw German infantry advancing dark figures against the white field. She knew what came next. Grenades, Molotovs, death by fire inside one's own machine. "Cover me," she said, unclipping her harness. Chebotko turned. "Don't you dare." But she was already through the hatch, crawling onto the glacis plate, boots slipping on ice. Bullets snapped around her. The Germans were only 100 meters away. She dropped into the snow, wrench in hand, and began working on the damaged track. The ground shook with nearby impacts. Shrapnel hissed through the air. One fragment sliced her sleeve, another chipped the pry bar. She ignored both. Her hands moved by memory. Disconnect the broken link, lever the idler arm, feed the replacement section in. The cold bit through her gloves, numbing her fingers, but she kept working. Inside the tank, her crew fired the machine gun in short bursts, laying a curtain of lead over her head. "Come on, Masha," the loader yelled through the intercom. "Come back!" She didn't answer. When the track was almost aligned, a shell detonated meters away. The blast threw her against the side of the hull. She fell, motionless. The crew dragged her back inside minutes later, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to her head and neck. She was conscious enough to whisper, "Did it hold?" "It held," said Chebotko. She smiled faintly, eyes half closed. "Then keep going." They kept fighting for another hour, the tank firing until its ammunition was gone. When relief arrived, fighting girlfriend was half buried in snow and smoke. Mariya was evacuated unconscious to a field hospital near Smolensk. Surgeons operated through the night, removing fragments of steel from her skull. For 2 months, she hovered between life and death, drifting in and out of delirium. Nurses remembered her murmuring engine commands in her sleep. Clutch in, throttle steady, tighten the linkage as if still driving. She never recovered. On March 15, 1944, Sergeant Mariya Oktyabrskaya died of her wounds. She was 39. Her comrades buried her with full military honors in Smolensk, beneath the banner of the 26th Guards Tank Brigade. Fighting girlfriend was salvaged and repaired again, repainted for new crews. The name stayed. Later that year, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet awarded her the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the first woman tanker ever to receive it. The citation read simply, "For courage and self-sacrifice in the defense of the motherland." In the post-war decades, veterans still spoke her name with the same tone they used for legendary machines. The KV-1, the T-34, the Katyusha, they said she had proved that steel obeyed the hands that loved it enough to risk everything. Today, her tank sits in a museum in Minsk, its olive paint faded, her name faint but legible beneath the dust. Boyevaya Podruga, Visitors ask why a woman would crawl under fire to fix a machine already doomed. The guides answer with the only truth the Eastern Front ever gave. Because that was the difference between living another hour or letting the enemy believe you'd stopped fighting. In that frozen field outside Vitebsk, surrounded by smoke and fire, the fighting girlfriend kept running just long enough to become immortal. Spring 1944 came late to Smolensk. Snow melted into grey mud that swallowed boots and blurred the trenches into rivers of memory. In the city's military cemetery, the ground was still frozen when they laid Sergeant Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya to rest. Her coffin, simple pine, draped in the red flag, was lowered beside the graves of men half her age. The honor guard fired 3 volleys. The echoes rolled across the empty airfield, where the 26th Guards Tank Brigade was already refitting for the next offensive. Lieutenant Chebotko stood at the head of the grave, cap in his hand. "She never stopped moving," he said softly. "Even when the machine did." The brigade chaplain wrote in the official record, "Died of wounds sustained in heroic fulfillment of duty. Example to all." But the crews who had fought beside her remembered something far simpler, that she had refused to let a machine die before its work was done. Back in Tomsk, word reached her sister through the local newspaper first. The headline read, "Hero of the Soviet Union Sergeant M.V. Oktyabrskaya." The article was full of patriotic flourishes, but between them was truth. A widow who had turned grief into iron, love into armor, and memory into movement. Her sister placed the clipping beside the last letter Mariya had sent home, oil-stained, folded and refolded so many times the paper had gone thin at the creases. It read, in part, "When I drive, I feel him with me. Every gear shift, every jolt, it's as if Sergei is pushing beside me. If I must fall, let it be while the engine still runs." That letter, now preserved in the archives of the Ministry of Defense, became one of the most quoted pieces of wartime correspondence in Soviet history. Schoolchildren memorized her name. Factories painted "fighting girlfriend" on assembly line tanks as a blessing before shipment to the front. After the war, "fighting girlfriend" itself, hull number 434, was recovered from a depot near Orsha. Mechanics stripped it for parts, then changed their minds when they saw the inscription still faintly visible beneath layers of soot. By order of the Commissariat of Defense, it was restored and displayed first in Smolensk, then Minsk, where it remains today. Visitors often mistake the name for propaganda invention, not realizing it had been written by her own hand, in white field paint, the night before her first battle. Post-war engineers studying combat records noted that her tank had logged 14 confirmed enemy positions destroyed and 3 armored vehicles neutralized before immobilization. In raw statistics, those numbers were unremarkable. But in morale, they were immeasurable. A field report from the brigade political officer in February 1944 recorded, "Oktyabrskaya's conduct increases cohesion and endurance of surrounding crews. Presence of female comrade in combat role produces mixture of pride and shame. Men push themselves harder." Even the Germans, reviewing captured intelligence, took note. A 1945 Wehrmacht psychological report on female participation in Soviet armored units mentioned her by name, misrendered as Mariya Oktyabrskaya, and concluded, "Such individuals embody the fanaticism of Bolshevism. Their bravery has propaganda value beyond their tactical impact." The author could not have understood that her bravery was not born of ideology but of love, weaponized by loss. Decades later, when veterans met again at reunions in Minsk and Smolensk, they spoke of her not as a symbol, but as a fellow soldier. The mechanic Ivan Kurash, who had trained with her at Omsk, recalled, "She didn't curse like us. When a machine broke, she talked to it, said, 'You'll go again, my girl.' And somehow, it did." In 1967, her name was carved into the granite memorial to Soviet tankers near Prokhorovka. Among the hundreds of men, hers is one of only 3 female names. Tour guides point it out to visitors as a curiosity, but to the aging tank crews who attend Remembrance Days, it means something else: the stubborn defiance that kept their machines running when supply lines collapsed, when fuel froze in the drums, when the only tools left were courage and wire. In the late 1982, during the period of glasnost, her letters were reprinted in magazines, newly freed to tell war stories, stripped of propaganda varnish. Readers were struck not by slogans, but by the quiet technical details. A woman describing clutch cables, radiator valves, the feel of the gearbox under her hand. To engineers and mechanics, she was no myth, she was one of them. When Western historians later examined Soviet archives, they confirmed the essentials of her story. The donations record existed, the correspondence with the Defense Committee was genuine. The combat reports from the 26th Guards Brigade matched eyewitness accounts. There was no invention, only interpretation. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the war's end, the National Museum of the Great Patriotic War unveiled a new exhibit. Her personal helmet, preserved leather, cracked and faded, the inside still marked in ink, MVO. A recording played her voice reading from a training log, a relic captured by a Red Army journalist. If you know your machine, she will never betray you. A girl of 16 stood before the display and whispered to her mother. She fixed her tank herself. Her mother nodded. Yes. And drove it, and fought in it. The girl stared at the steel giant looming above her. Then she wasn't crazy, she said. She was just unstoppable. That word, unstoppable, became the essence of her legacy. The mad mechanic who welded grief into motion remains proof that a single act of defiance can outlast the empire that gave it context. In every sense that mattered, Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya never stopped driving. She is still there, hands on the levers, engine roaring, pushing forward through smoke and snow, proving that even in the machinery of total war, the heart could be stronger than steel. The T-34 inside the Minsk Museum sits silent now, its engine stilled for 80 years. But each spring, when veterans gather in their medals and schoolchildren lay carnations along the exhibit floor, the silence feels alive. Guides begin their story the same way. This is the fighting girlfriend. She was built with grief and driven by love. They speak her name, Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya, and the hall fills with a soft metallic hum, as if the air itself remembers the rhythm of her engine. Long before the myth hardened into memory, her legacy was a practical one. Mechanics in Soviet training schools studied her field improvisations. Her after-action reports preserved in the archives of the 26th Guards Tank Brigade listed not slogans but solutions. Lubricant freezing in negative 20 degrees Celsius conditions mix kerosene 1.5. Track pin deformation use gun breech rod for leverage. Those notes circulated through the Red Army's repair depots in 1944 and 1945, saving countless tanks that would otherwise have been abandoned in mud or snow. A technical manual printed in 1946 on emergency field repairs of T-34 vehicles quotes her procedures verbatim without naming her. Only decades later did historians cross-reference the handwriting and realize they came from the woman the propaganda posters had called the fighting girlfriend. Her expertise had outlived her fame. In the years after victory, the Soviet Union transformed remembrance into ritual. Streets, schools, and factories bore the names of heroes. Her portrait joined those of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya and Yekaterina Budanova on classroom walls. But where other heroines were remembered for sacrifice or vengeance, Mariya's story struck a different chord. It was about competence, about the unglamorous, necessary craft of keeping things running in chaos. In 1953, a young factory worker named Tatiana Orlova wrote to Komsomolskaya Pravda, "They tell us to be brave like the snipers or loyal like the nurses. But I want to be like Oktyabrskaya. She fixed what was broken and never waited for someone else to do it." That letter was published on International Women's Day. For one morning, across the vast nation she'd helped defend, workers, engineers, and drivers saw in her story not tragedy, but instruction. Her legacy even crossed borders. In 1962, at the US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, Soviet delegates presented newly declassified footage from the Eastern Front. Among the reels was a brief, grainy clip of fighting girlfriend crossing a snowy field, her whitewashed armor streaked with soot. American veterans in attendance later recalled the room falling silent. One of them, a former P-38 mechanic named Jack Larson, reportedly murmured, "That woman knew her machine." It was a small moment of mutual respect between two former enemy's men who understood that war, in the end, belongs to those who keep engines alive. By the 1982nd, when surviving tank crews were old men with medals that outlived the country they fought for, they began to tell stories that never made the newspapers. At one reunion, held in 1,985 inches, Smolensk, a veteran named Ivan Karpov stood and said, "We called her mad, but she wasn't. She just refused to accept that steel had limits. That's what saved us more than once. Because when her tank moved, ours couldn't stop." A younger historian in the audience recorded those words and later found Chebotko's wartime diary in the archives. One entry, dated November 17, 1943, described her standing on the hull after repairing the track. She laughed at the bullets. Not bravado, something else, like she'd made peace with them. That image would later inspire a bronze memorial outside Omsk's tank training center. A woman in a mechanic's uniform, one foot on a damaged track, wrench raised as if defying gravity itself. Today, historians treat her not as a propaganda invention but as a crucial figure in understanding women's integration into frontline combat. Out of more than 800,000 Soviet women who served, fewer than 24 fought as armored crew. Of those, she remains the most documented. Her personnel file still carries the grease fingerprints she left when signing her pay ledger. In 2013, Russia issued a commemorative coin bearing her likeness. The reverse showed a T-34 in motion, treads grinding forward. The words, "Boyevaya podruga, fighting girlfriend," engraved beneath. When collectors asked why this inscription, curators answered, because she named it herself. The power of her story lies not only in courage, but in its mechanical poetry, the idea that devotion could take the form of maintenance, that love could manifest as talk and sweat. Her battlefield was as much under the tank as behind its gun. In a war defined by annihilation, she embodied restoration. When everything around her broke, she reached for a wrench. The museum guides end their tours with her own words, preserved from an interview with a Red Army correspondent weeks before her final battle. "War destroys everything it touches. My job is to make one thing work again, even if it kills me." Outside, children press their palms to the cold steel of the fighting girlfriend's hull. Somewhere deep inside, the metal still carries the echo of her heartbeat, the thrum of diesel, the pulse of motion, the proof that what she fixed once has never truly stopped running. By the turn of the 21st century, only a handful of people still living had seen Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya alive. The rest knew her through films, museum placards, and schoolbook paragraphs that reduced her to a slogan, the first woman to drive her own tank into battle. But as historians reopened Soviet archives after 1991, the myth cracked open and a fuller, stranger, more human story came spilling out. The discovery began in 1996, when a researcher named Natalia Kurbatova, working in the Air Force Historical Research Agency's Joint Russian Exchange, came across a packet labeled Personal, Correspondence 1942-43. Inside were Maria's handwritten letters, smudged with oil stains and pencil indentations so deep they scored the paper. These weren't the sanitized propaganda versions printed in wartime newspapers, they were mechanical diaries. She wrote not about patriotism, but about torque ratios, gearbox stiffness, and fuel quality. "The diesel does not breathe well at altitude," one line read. Another, "The left brake pedal travels too far, possible leak in hydraulic line." Between those notes ran currents of grief and love. "Sergei would have laughed at my hands. They are all burns and blisters, but the machine listens to me now." Kurbatova's publication of those letters in Wojenno-Historicheski Journal in 1998 transformed Mariya from myth into engineer, a woman who grieved by mastering the language of steel. Modern restoration teams studying her tank at the Belarusian Great Patriotic War Museum confirmed the same fingerprints of obsession. When they disassembled Fighting Girlfriend in 2002 for preservation, they found minor modifications no factory worker would have attempted under wartime pressure. Fuel lines rerouted for easier priming, a hand-filed notch in the shift lever to mark neutral. A scrap of linen bound around the starter cable to prevent fraying. "These are the signatures of someone who knew her machine like a doctor knows a heartbeat," said Chief Conservator Viktor Drozd. "She wasn't just a driver, she was a designer." The museum left those changes untouched. In a small glass case nearby, they placed her personal wrench steel worn, smooth from thousands of grips. Visitors notice that the handle bends slightly inward, as if the tool itself had absorbed her determination. Scholars revisiting combat reports from the 339th Fighter Squadron and 13 Fighter Command, the same units that flew air cover over Smolensk, found her name mentioned in after-action summaries from American observers attached to the Red Army in 1943. One report noted simply, "Female tank driver observed performing field repair under heavy fire. Conduct extraordinary." That corroboration, buried for decades among aviation logs, confirmed what Soviet veterans had always sworn was true. She hadn't been a propaganda invention. She'd been seen, documented, and respected by foreign officers who had no reason to embellish. In post-Soviet Russia, where monuments were being re-evaluated and myths dismantled, her story proved uniquely resilient. The new generation of historians less concerned with ideology than with authenticity found in her a kind of moral ballast. She represents the transitional point, historian Sergei Maximenko wrote in 2007, between the mythic motherland and the practical modern woman, between sacrifice and skill. The press dubbed her the Iron Widow, a name that captured both her grief and her defiance. Documentaries followed, including the 2012 film Steel Heart, which used her actual letters as narration. In the final scene, an actress in a tanker's padded helmet wipes oil from her hands and whispers, "Come on, girl," echoing the phrase Mariya was known to murmur to her T-34 before every sortie. At the 2015 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, an aging American pilot named George Whitaker, who had once escorted Soviet supply convoys to Murmansk, was asked what he remembered most about his wartime allies. He smiled and said, "They had a woman who fixed her own tank under fire. That's what I tell my grandkids about the Eastern Front." 8,000 miles away, in Minsk, schoolchildren visited her tank the same week. Their teacher told them that bravery wasn't only charging forward, sometimes it was staying put with a wrench while bullets sang overhead. One boy raised his hand. "Did she win?" The teacher thought for a moment. "She didn't live," she said. "But yes, she won." The historian Kurbatova, standing before that same tank years later, found herself running her hand along its dented armor. "You can still feel where the track broke," she said quietly, "and where she fixed it." Outside, the city hummed with traffic, modern engines replacing the thunder of 1943. Yet inside the hall, the old diesel smell lingered faintly in the steel, an echo of burnt oil, fear, and devotion. For all the wars that came after, all the new machines and nations. The lesson of Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya remained unchanged. When everything collapses, the ones who endure are those who can build again by hand, by heart, by sheer refusal to stop. The Iron Widow had proved that even in the machinery of war, humanity could still leave fingerprints. By 2020, the Fighting Girlfriend had become more than a relic. She was an argument, a piece of steel through which nations debated memory itself. In Minsk, where her tank still stood beneath its glass canopy, the curators noticed something strange. Visitors no longer came to look at the tank. They came to look through it, through its cracked vision slit, through the scars on its armor, into the world that had built it. Schoolchildren pressed their noses to the glass. Mechanics leaned close to study the welds. Veterans saluted. Tourists simply whispered. And somewhere under all those layers of reverence and silence, there was the ghost of a woman who had refused to stay still. That spring, a restoration team began a full structural analysis of the T-34-76 hull. They found the steel fatigued, the suspension warped from decades of display. When they lifted the turret with modern cranes, they discovered something that froze the technicians in place. A folded scrap of canvas wedged between the ammunition rack and the turret floor. Inside was a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges of Mariya and her husband, Sergei, in their pre-war uniforms. Written on the back, in faded ink, were 3 words. "Keep her running. No one knows when." She hid it there. Perhaps before her first battle. Perhaps during a lull between repairs. But the phrase became the motto of the restoration project. One engineer later admitted, "We talked about the tank like it was alive. We said, she wants to move again." When they reassembled the hull, they left the photo sealed in a protective case beneath the turret floor, exactly where she'd placed it. A relic inside a relic. A memory welded into the machinery. Across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Mariya's story resurfaced in documentaries, novels, even video games. But the digital recreations missed something: the weight of her hands, the smell of scorched oil, the sound of gears grinding back to life. Historians tried to correct the record. In 2021, a team from the National World War II Museum and the Naval History and Heritage Command produced a joint paper titled The Mechanic and the Myth. It compared Soviet propaganda records with U.S. aerial reconnaissance logs and Red Army after-action reports. The conclusion was simple. She was real. The battles were real. The tank was real. Only the disbelief was fiction. A single footnote cited an American observer from 13 Fighter Command, whose debriefing on the 22nd of October 1943 recorded, "Observed lone Soviet tank immobilized near Smolensk, one individual outside, conducting repair under fire." Gender uncertain. Remarkable courage. It was the earliest independent record of her final stand, proof that somewhere above her, a contrail marked the moment the legend took shape. Modern audiences rediscovered her through her contradictions. She was both a patriot and a widow, both soldier and mechanic. Feminists saw an icon of agency, engineers saw a colleague, soldiers saw one of their own. The paradox was what kept her alive. In 2023, a museum guide described it best. "Every visitor sees what they need. Some see heroism, some see grief. I see craftsmanship." That year, the fighting girlfriend was finally moved to a climate-controlled hall. The relocation was broadcast live across Belarusian television. When the crane lifted the tank, the crowd gasped. The underside still bore a small dented panel, patch-welded by hand, likely by Mariya herself. The weld was rough, uneven, but still holding after 80 years. Engineers later measured it. Tensile integrity at 94%, stronger than factory seams. One of the welders whispered, "She did this in the dark, under fire." He traced the bead with a gloved hand. She knew what she was doing. That moment completed the circle. Mariya's story had begun with a broken tank in a field outside Smolensk. It ended with that same tank lifted into light, every scar preserved, every imperfection honored. The world around it had changed, nations risen and fallen, ideologies turned to dust, but the machine she had refused to abandon still endured, solid, stubborn, whole. When the final bolt was secured and the lights dimmed, the curator placed a single sign beside the exhibit. It read, "This tank was repaired in battle by Sergeant Mariya Vasilyevna Oktyabrskaya, hero of the Soviet Union 1905–1944. She believed a machine could carry love. History proved her right." Outside, evening traffic hummed like distant engines. Inside, beneath the museum lights, the fighting girlfriend stood silent but unbroken steel, made sacred by human hands. And if you listened closely, past the echoes of time and the murmur of visitors, you could almost hear her voice again, calm, commanding, certain, "Keep her running."